Thank you all for coming and hearing about this important book on the impact of Palestine activism on individuals, our panelists, the people in the book, and not just the people in the book, but particularly our friends, our neighbors here in Hamilton. My name is Lil, and I will be your moderator tonight. This evening is presented by the Hamilton chapter of Independent Jewish Voices Canada. We will be, we'll be hearing a bit about them shortly. It is co-sponsored by Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. Coalition, wave to us. Okay. We're grateful to the publisher. We're grateful to the publisher Baraka Books and City Books for bringing copies of this wonderful book for sale. It looks like this, and full of highlighting and notes. I'd also like to thank Jennifer Hompoth, Chair of Council, New Vision United Church, who facilitated our use of this space. Where's Jennifer? Let's give Jennifer. Jennifer will give the land acknowledgement.
Hi, friends. For some odd reason that I'm sure my forebears could never imagine, I am now the chair of this giant colonial institution. And I always think of this place as being situated in these four corners of Hamilton, where you have the Carnegie Library, Hamilton Place, that's now managed by Carmen's group, AKA, we know who they are. And then there's the Bank of Montreal on the other corner. Then there's us. So really, the United Church was a part of building a colonial infrastructure on this land that is still stolen land. And so we live within those tensions. We try to do our best to be in solidarity with migrants, with the queer and trans community, with people who are poor and unhoused, because that's how we believe that we should proceed, and yet we live with those contradictions. So this land, before it was the corner of McNabb in Maine, was the traditional territory and still is the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, and then the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas. We are still treaty people. And so as we do this event, as we proceed to think about stolen land, as we proceed to think about what it means to live in the tensions, I invite us all to remember what it means to do cross-sectoral work with Indigenous solidarity in a moment where our earth and this nation is being ravaged in order to make money for those who run it. So as we do this, I'm so happy that you guys are all here. And yeah, please let us know if you ever want to do, subversive work. We're here for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Now, Rabbi David Mivasser will tell us briefly about IJV, who are presenting the launch, and then offer a prayer.
Yeah, so Independent Jewish Voices Canada began a little more than 15 years ago as a Canada-wide Jewish organization standing up as Jews for justice for the people of Palestine. And we're growing. There's a very active chapter in Hamilton, and there's more than 25 other chapters across Canada. And we welcome everyone to affiliate with us. If you're a Jewish person, be a member. And if you're not a Jewish person, sign up as a supporter. And it makes a difference. It grows our numbers, and it connects us all with each other, and it makes us that much more powerful. And if you're interested, there's a place to sign up in the back. So I'll leave it at that. Jennifer Humpoth, who just spoke right before me, asked me if I would lead a Jewish prayer tonight. And I'm happy to do that, but it's not a particularly Jewish prayer. It's a prayer for everyone. In a lot of traditions, including the Jewish tradition, there's an idea that came from somewhere a long time ago that someone is going to come and make things better for us. I think it's almost like a child wishing for mommy or daddy to come and make everything better. So one attitude is we're waiting. And another attitude that's also deeply embedded in Jewish religion, I heard it best being said that when we no longer need the Messiah, that's when the Messiah will be here. When we work out what we need to do in this world and we get it, justice, peace, generosity, living together with all the creatures, when we get there, that's when the Messiah will be here. So my prayer for tonight, I heard just a week or two ago, and it originated with an amazing singing group in Washington, D.C. called Sweet Honey in the Rock. And it's got just a few words that I'm going to sing and invite you to sing with me. It's 2 parts. I was going to try to do the 2 parts together, and Lil suggested, nah, too complicated. So the first part goes like this. We are the ones, we are the ones, we are waiting. We are the ones, we are the ones, we are waiting. Do that 2 more times. We are the ones, we are the ones, we are waiting. 1 more time. We are the ones, we are the ones, we are waiting. In the second part, we are the ones we are waiting for. We are the ones we are waiting for. Just 2 more times. We are the ones we are waiting for. We are the ones we are waiting for. Amen.
Thank you, David. So I have a few questions for the audience. First of all, please raise your hand, panelists included, if your job or your security have been affected by your stance on the genocide in Gaza. Raise your hands if your job or your security has been affected. Some of you, thank you. Now please raise your hand if your concern about possible negative impacts at work or a volunteer with a community group have led you to not express opinions, not wear a button or a keffiyeh, or not take actions that you would otherwise do. Please raise your hand if you have wanted to wear a button or something but decided not to. Okay, thank you. I see several hands. Finally, please raise your hand if you're afraid to raise your hand. Okay, nobody there. Okay, here are our panelists. I will introduce them briefly. We will then hear about their experience. And please save your questions, and then we'll have our presentations. Please save your questions for the presentations. First of all, we have Catherine Grajechuk. I've been practicing. She was fired after 15 years as a York Region paramedic for making a social media comment critical of Israel and calling for workers to join an anti-war rally. Catherine is a contributor to the book. Next, who's next? We have Angeloun Deslauriers is a Hamilton labor and peace activist who has been targeted at work for her support for Palestinian human rights. Next, we have Birju Datani. Birju was appointed Canada's Chief Human Rights Commissioner in 2024. He resigned from the position prior to commencing his term following Zionist organizations' demands that he be removed. And next we have Jill Rogan. Jillian is an assistant professor, University of Windsor Faculty of Law, and a member of the Jewish Faculty Network and Independent Jewish Voices. She is a contributor to the book. Next to Jill, we have Dr. Mohammed Zubairi. He's an associate professor at McMaster Medical School. He experienced a significant campaign to have him dismissed as Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Director for advocating for humanitarian efforts in Palestine. And at the end of our table, we have Mason Fitzpatrick, is still a grad student, is a former grad student at McMaster and former president of CUPE Local 3906. He was made persona non grata at McMaster for Palestine activism. So a hand for our panelists.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And I know we're sitting up here with our stories, but as your hands indicated, I'm sure there's many of you in the room that have faced punishment as well over this issue. So I worked as a paramedic for York Region since 2010. I was the president of my CUPE local, a large composite municipal local, for the last 6 years. In May this summer, I was returning to work after a prolonged union leave, which I was on because I was the president, and I was being retrained as a paramedic. On June 19th at 1 a.m., I posted a comment on Facebook. I was not identifiable anywhere on my Facebook account as working for York Region or even as a paramedic. The comment that I posted was on a CUPE Ontario post promoting the Hands Off Iran rally in response to Israel's aggressive bombing campaign. And you should also know that I actually hold an elected position on the executive board of CUPE Ontario. So I was directly commenting on a rally that my union is involved in. So I said, in the last 2 years, Israel has bombed Palestine, Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, and now Iran. They have been occupying Palestine for 75 plus years. They are luring starving Palestinian children to their concentration camp food aid depots so they can snipe them dead. They keep murdering workers, media, healthcare, municipal. They just mass murdered 15 first responders, including 7 paramedics. Any union or other organization that doesn't fight this is choosing to stay silent during genocide. Thanks CUPE Ontario and Toronto and New York Region Labour Council for asking members to join these demonstrations to stop the bombing of Iran. You're one of the few who stand in solidarity with workers. And so that was my comment that went up at 1 a.m. on June 19th. On Friday, June the 20th, I was called into an investigation meeting where my employer informed me that they've received complaints about this particular Facebook post, and they asked me questions about the post. I was then told to wait outside, brought back in 20 minutes later, told that I was being terminated effective immediately with cause for serious misconduct. In the 15 years that I've worked for York Region, I've never once been disciplined or even counseled on my job performance. The employers never brought to my attention any issues with my patient care, job performance, or even any social media activity. This was certainly not the first time that I was posting something like this on Facebook or thanking my union for taking a difficult position. On June 22nd, Gila Marto, who is a City of Vaughan councillor for Ward 5 at the City of Vaughan, the City of Vaughan is one of the lower tier municipalities that makes up York Region, posted the following comment on her public Facebook feed. She said, on Friday, June 20th, I was made aware of a paramedic employed by York Region who had allegedly posted a hateful message on social media. Vaughan Mayor Stephen Del Duca immediately reached out to the chair of York Region with the community's concerns. The matter was investigated, and we have received confirmation that the individual is no longer employed by York Region. And so I decided to speak publicly about my termination because by the end of that weekend, and I was fired on Friday, by the end of that weekend, all of the information was already publicly available on social media. There had been posts from on X from Zionist social media influencer Dahlia Kurtz with my photo, asking people to contact York Region if they had issues with me providing them patient care. And interestingly, that post only went up on Saturday, which was the morning after I had already been terminated. So this post, independent journalist Rachel Gilmore saw this post, and so she contacted the region, and they actually provided the following information to her, which she shared online. So they wrote her an email saying thank you for reaching out to York Region. On Thursday, June 19th, York Region became aware of an employee allegedly posting concerning comments on social media. York Region promptly investigated the matter. Maintaining public safety and confidence is of utmost importance to York Region. The employee is no longer employed with the Regional Municipality of York. York Region remains committed to fostering welcoming and inclusive communities as affirmed by the Inclusion Charter of York Region. And so I had never even received anything in writing from the region on Friday. They said they didn't have a termination letter ready. And having received nothing in writing from them and then opening social media on Monday after I was fired on Friday and seeing these types of posts where they were providing information to anybody who was publicly emailing them to ask about my employment. And so I decided that I wasn't going to sit quietly while a politician mischaracterized my speech as hateful and my employer suggested that I was a threat to public safety. So I know when folks are making the calculation of whether to speak publicly, I think we really need to understand the gravity of the current moment. And for me, Gaza is a battleground for the future of humanity. And what is at stake? What is at stake is whether we allow capitalism in its imperialist form to murder 2 million people so that developers and the rich can get even richer, they can build a Riviera, they can extract oil, or whether we are going to insist that people have the right to live on their land in peace. That is what is being fought over in Gaza right now. And so employers don't own our conscience, and they cannot, and we cannot allow them to dictate our ability to organize around issues that are relevant to us as workers. We often say as workers, when we talk about a strike, that we are drawing the line. And I think it's really important that folks draw the line and say, we own our own conscience and we can speak to our conscience, and you don't own that as an employer. There is no paycheck that is worth buying our silence in the face of genocide. And the other reason I decided to speak publicly was because the message that had been sent, because all of this was already out publicly, is that public sector employees were going to look at this and say, so we don't have a right to speak out about the genocide. And if I had sat quietly for the next 3 years before this got in front of an arbitrator, I think that was really the wrong message to send. I think it was really important for me to push back and say, actually, we have this right, and the only reason we have rights and we've ever had rights is because we take them, not because we wait for a court to grant us those rights at some point in the future.
So, as Lil said, I'm Angeline, and I live here in Hamilton, not far from here. I could walk to the church from my house. And I've been involved in a lot of things in Hamilton related to refugee resettlement for years. And of course, when the genocide accelerated after October 2023 in Palestine, it really affected me and my family. We talk about it. And in the spring of 2024, my family and I, my kids, drew in chalk on the sidewalk, chalk and kids paint and temporary paint, all kinds of things, watermelons, free Palestine, from the river to the sea, messages like that, even something like zero genocide. And a couple of weeks later, I work for the Ontario Public Service, and I have been active in anti-racism initiatives, employee-led anti-racism initiatives, and I was in the middle of a virtual presentation when somebody sent me a message saying, "Oh, I'm really sorry about the email," and I was like, I don't know what email that they're talking about, but I'm gonna have to wait until my presentation is over to check it out. And then after the presentation was over, they forwarded it to me, because of course it wasn't sent to me, but it was sent, so as I said, I'm with the public service, so there's an online directory. Anybody who knows my name can search in a search engine and find me, and they found me, my manager, my whole team, the minister of the ministry that I work for, the premier. They copied many rabbis in Hamilton. They copied Rebel News, CBC, any kind of random public offices at the ministry I work for, saying that that I was hateful and anti-Semitic, inciting violence against the people of Israel. All of this because of the chalk drawings on the sidewalk. And they're saying that I'm a supporter of terrorism, rape, torture, murder, kidnapping, asking, how Ontario is paying for my salary, my income, and whether, the government supports this terror and hate and anti-Semitic behavior, basically asking for me to be fired, and saying that they'd notified the police about all this. And of course, it was anonymous. So my office, my manager was very understanding, but they still had to ask questions like, why would this person send this email? What are you doing? What messages are on your sidewalk? So I had to provide some pictures of the sidewalk and things that were there, which obviously contradicted the messages in the email. And my manager talked to the IT department, and they blocked that email address. I made a complaint to the police, and they said they could not trace the email address. But then eventually, in talking to other neighbors on the street, I discovered who it was, because this person had been using that email address to harass other people on the street. So I went to the police with this information, and they went and talked to the guy. But they basically took it as a difference of opinions, not hateful and not harassment. And they went and told the guy to knock it off. And he said, that he was just going to do it again, because he still disagreed with whatever it was that I was saying. So that was that story. But along with that, over the last couple of years, I've been aware of multiple complaints that people have made through the Human Rights Office for the employees of the Ontario Public Service for any kind of expressions of sympathy with Palestinians, expressions of solidarity, the use of the word genocide, apartheid, settler colonization, complaints are made to the Human Rights Office, and they're taken seriously when they should be dismissed on their face. People have been dragged through processes and investigations, which really amount to harassment for their association with Palestinians or for just being Palestinian, and totally making a mockery of these human rights processes and policies. And on top of all of that, these processes are confidential, and the policies state that if anybody even talks about being involved in a human rights complaint, that they could be disciplined up to dismissal. So there's people who defy those rules, who have talked to each other and that I've heard about, so that we know that there are these frivolous and vexatious complaints that are allowed to go forward. The majority of them are dismissed, but it really makes people afraid in the workplace to be who they are, to be Palestinians, to be a supporter of human rights, to talk about anything. And this, I was thinking about, I've talked about support for Syrians. I've talked about support for all kinds of human rights causes in the workplace. And I've never been targeted until I spoke up for Palestinians. And a lot of people worry about the cost to their employment, or I worry about the cost to my employment as well. But to me, the cost to my morality and my principles would be much greater if I were silent on this genocide. And that's it. And I couldn't be quiet about it.
Hello, Hamilton. First of all, I want to thank IJV Hamilton for organizing this event, and in particular, for affording me an opportunity to speak to you here this evening. IJV as an organization has supported me consistently and throughout some of my darkest days navigating what I've been navigating. So as someone of a Muslim background, I do want to say that, I always feel comfortable and at home in the presence of my Jewish cousins. There's an expression in Arabic that translates into literally the children of my father's brother, older brother. And I've always felt like that in the company of my siblings and my cousins at IJV. So I do want to extend, from the bottom of my heart, the gratitude of being afforded this opportunity to speak. And to give you a sense of an overview of what I experienced, in June of 2024, I was appointed by the Governor General on the recommendation of the Justice Minister to be Canada's Chief Commissioner of the Canadian Human Rights Commission. My entire career, or most of my career, has been spent in human rights. I was an assistant director at the Alberta Human Rights Commission for Northern Alberta. I was then appointed director of the Yukon Human Rights Commission. And so after a career in human rights, oftentimes managing human rights commissions, I was appointed to that role. Interesting that when the Justice Department made it public, you have this intuition that something, bad is going to happen. You just don't know what it is. I think for me, previously, when there would be press releases about my appointment, not the first time I was subject to a press release, I know not to read comment sections of newspapers because, they're often loaded with immensely racist jabs at your name, or, you look like something and then using racist imagery. So I know better and have known better for long enough, but also makes you a little bit queasy. There are plenty of people on Twitter, I'll never call it X, by the way, who just live to say and do nasty things. And so I remember feeling some sense of discomforture. And then immediately, I think every week, multiple times a week, hit piece after hit piece would appear in our national legacy media institutions. So the Globe and Mail, the National Post, et cetera, et cetera. And I think since we're here to discuss suppression of Palestinian solidarity, calls for Palestinian human rights, which is what the book behind you is addressing, I think I'm going to focus my remarks today primarily on that side of things, because I think it's really suppression in the true sense of the word. And there's something interesting to glean from it all. And so to give you a sense of the things that were written about me, was a lot of buzzwords. I mean, rarely were there actually allegations concerning me. So, for example, allegation number one, I delivered lectures at Israel Apartheid Week at several universities. What I said at those lectures, nobody really knew, but it was bad enough that I was present at Israel Apartheid Week giving a lecture on who knows what, but the word apartheid appears. So, that's bad enough. Or that I appeared on a panel alongside somebody who wrote a book that said the following. So, guilt by association. Or I was on a panel, nothing to do with Israel, sharing a panel with someone who, after somebody did some digging, was a part of an organization. Now, this is back in 2014, that I shared space with someone in 2014 who was a part of an organization that 11 years later would be prescribed in the United Kingdom as a terrorist organization by a conservative government after a really bad Piers Morgan appearance. Interesting. And of course, I had no idea that person hadn't been presented to me as a member of that organization. They were presented as a journalist and didn't really care because being on a panel is not a team sport. I think the really interesting one is I was told, or there's a story in the Globe and Mail that said he shared a panel with Moazzam Begg. For those of you who haven't heard that name, though I know I'm speaking to a highly informed and literate audience, Moazzam Begg was a detainee in Guantanamo Bay. He was released without charge and given a settlement by the British government for having been detained without charge. So it was a problem that appeared with him on a panel. On that same panel was someone from Breitbart News. They failed to mention that. And so it was never suggested that that was a problem or that I would hold the views of the person that Breitbart News has, because my name is hard to pronounce, but not necessarily the way that Catherine's name is hard to pronounce. I'm from a different part of the world geographically. So my name is hard to pronounce, but in a scary security way, hard to pronounce. So it is assumed that I share the views of whatever other brown Muslim people are on the panel. I can't possibly share the views of Breitbart News because they're white supremacists. It doesn't really go with the narrative that they're promulgating. But I think in one particular week, the Globe and Mail did 4 stories about me in 5 days. And it was only 4 because I think it was a long weekend. It was approaching Canada Day. But one of them was a throwaway line from my PhD thesis, or a chapter of it. And the headline read, Canada's new human rights chief once made academic argument that terrorism can be rational, ellipses, I think. And so rational doesn't mean good, by the way. I'm sitting, to my left sits a distinguished professor of criminal law, or criminal law practitioner. So, when you hear conservative politicians talking about increasing prison sentences because, it'll deter people from committing crimes. Okay, so you've just conceded that that person is rational. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense to deter people from committing crimes because they're irrational. So something that a conservative politician does routinely, I, of course, can't be permitted to say because, and this brings me to, I won't take up too much more of your time, but there's something that's called intellectual profiling. Intellectual profiling is when there are certain people from certain backgrounds who aren't allowed to study certain things because it's assumed that they can't be objective or they secretly sympathize with something. That particular article in the Globe and Mail, there were no less than a dozen academics across the country that said, this looks like a bad faith smear job. I teach about terrorism, and he's basically basic human right, international relations 101 theory. Of course, terrorism can be rational, it can be irrational. In the social sciences, rational is not morally good. But it's this idea that as someone who's a racialized Muslim, that when I'm talking about it, an institution where I'm engaged in a PhD program, I somehow must have sympathies. Had anybody read that chapter, they would have seen that it actually discussed state terror. It wasn't actually talking about terrorist groups. What it was suggesting is, unfortunately, when states basically engage in terrorism and then use crafty arguments to say that the Geneva Convention only prohibits attacks whose primary purpose is terrorism or to induce terror. If it's a secondary purpose, it's okay. The point is that if you keep making those arguments, then the terrorist groups, quote unquote, insurgents, things like that, are going to make the same arguments. And then we're not really further ahead. So maybe nobody should be resorting to terrorism. That's really the argument that chapter was attempting to make. But intellectual profiling happens when people of a certain background can't engage with certain ideas lest they be too sympathetic. We don't do that to other people. And just to give you an example, I don't know how many of you heard of calls from certain conservative politicians and others to strip Mohammed Faqih of his Order of Canada. Maybe show of hands, if, okay. So, Mohammed Faqih has never said anything more stridently or stronger than what Gabor Mate, or contributor to the book Livy Davis, both of whom are members of the Order of Canada, have mentioned. But nobody calls for their Order of Canada to be rescinded, nor should they, by the way. These things shouldn't be, if you're a good lapdog of the state, then you get the rewards. But we know that this is kind of what happens. So there seems to be, one of the patterns of what happened to me can be described as intellectual profiling, these arguments of safety. The second was op-eds describing how I could not be impartial or free of bias, or that the Jewish community had every reasonable fear that I could not be biased or impartial, which I never understood. And there's something interesting about this too, because the people that say you've been critical of Israel means you're biased is, of course, circular, because it implies that the only argument or conclusion you can draw from looking at data is one that is not adverse to the state of Israel. So unless you're pro-Israel, you're biased, right? So premise number one, all arguments which are critical of Israel in a way that implies callousness or cruelty towards Palestinians is biased. This person made a criticism of Israel in that way, therefore they're biased. It's a circle. And I always felt nauseous on merry-go-rounds going back to when I was a child, so that didn't set well with me. But one of the people that they enlisted, iPolitics, ran an op-ed from someone named Dave Thomas. So Dave Thomas was, up until fairly recently, the chair of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. he wrote an article basically saying that the Jewish community would reasonably fear that I could not be impartial, and for him, that human rights activists should be disqualified from ever having a role in a human rights commission. Make of that what you will. And that wasn't the irony that was delicious. 6 months after he wrote that, the federal court deemed that on a decision he made, it was remitted back to a differently constituted tribunal because, quote, not quote, I'm going to paraphrase, he lost the requisite objectivity required, and that the court found that he had met the legal test for reasonable apprehension of bias in a decision he was delivering called Adiran versus Canada. So the person that they pulled up to write an article basically saying I was biased, 6 months later got smacked down for a court for being biased. And again, this idea that words like bias are thrown around, but there's something that is race-driven there too, because it assumes that I must be biased because as a religious doctrine, I must hate Israel and Jews, right? That's basically what's being said. It's what's implied in a lot of these articles. So after dozens and of hit pieces, I had resigned on August the 12th, and one of the things that was really interesting that I discovered, having met different people, is no less than 6 op-eds supporting me had been suppressed in various media outlets. Shanaz Karmarli discussed one in response to a Robin Yerbach piece. Robin Yerbach wrote an article saying that maybe all of this was unfair to me, but that I can't even appear, people can't even believe or suspect that I was biased. Can you imagine? So if I then called her Islamophobic, does she have to step down from the Globe and Mail because someone made the accusation, the idea that accusation sits as evidence? Incidentally, she never said anything about Dave Thomas, right? She didn't hold him to that standard, nor did she hold Justice David Spiro to that standard. For those of you, show of hands, familiar with the Valentina Azarova affair? So David Spiro, the Azarova affair professor who was offered a job as the director of the University of Toronto's International Human Rights Program, had her job rescinded because Justice David Spiro, who I believe was formerly a member of CIJA, attempted to convince those that made the offer to rescind the offer. The Chief Justice, in light of that, and when this had gone to the Judicial Council, the Chief Justice had, as an interim measure, prevented David Spiro from hearing any cases where the litigants or their lawyers were Muslim, Arab, or perceived to be such, because he was concerned. No calls for David Spiro, he's still on the bench. So this idea of double standards that you hear about, they're there, but not in a way that they're often discussed. And so I'm probably taking too long, and I don't want to trespass on the time of my fellow panelists, but that is, in a nutshell, what happened to me by way of suppression. And a lot of it was carried out by the national press. But I'm going to pause there, and I know that there's a Q&A session coming. But I'm also very grateful to be sitting next to the panelists that I'm sitting next to. And I'm looking forward to hearing their stories very carefully. And I'm very sorry to all of you for what you have experienced. And you have my deepest solidarity.
So thank you so much to IJV, to the organizers, and a really special thank you to Leila Marshy, who brought this book together. I've read it, and I was aware of almost everything that was written in it before I read the book. But one of the things that I think is happening in the last 2 or 3 years is that we lose track of these atrocities because we're bombarded by atrocities. And so I think one of the most important things is to document them in one place. And it not only documents the reprisals that you've all faced which is so important, but it documents who was doing the reprisals and where they stood in this historical moment. So I'm sitting here in a very different position than I think all of my co-panelists. I'm an associate professor with tenure. I spoke about Palestine before that, so there was never a time when I didn't speak about Palestine. So when I think about what happened, what brought me here to this panel, I think about the past 20 years or so of the attacks levied by pro-Israel lobby groups towards those who speak Palestine. All of the Jewish identified groups that I'm a member of now, and historically, we work tirelessly to respond to the threats, harassment, lawfare, doxing, and lobbying done by pro-Israel lobby groups. And we try to act in solidarity with those who are targeted. I'm one of the co-authors of a recent report on one particular lobby group, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, CIJA. They are a prominent voice that promotes violence against Palestinians, and they insist that such violence, including genocide, is necessary for Jewish safety. And so what we tried to do was expose them. And our report found that they also engage in anti-Semitic rhetoric, including that there's one Jewish community in Canada that monolithically supports Zionism and the State of Israel. They repeat dual loyalty tropes with respect to Jews, and they completely erase anti-Zionist Jewish voices and history. And since we released our report on CIJA, we, the co-authors, have not been served with any lawsuits. We were worried. We were all panicking. To our knowledge, there's no lawsuits. No one's been served. They haven't responded publicly in any way. I haven't received any threats or backlash. They haven't contacted my employer that I'm aware of. And I've noticed that especially in the last 2 or 3 years, CIJA and other groups are very silent when it comes to anti-Zionist Jewish voices. This silence has been particularly salient since October 7th, 2023. And it seems to me that the strategy is that they don't want the public to know that there's a growing number of anti-Zionist Jewish people. There's one survey, and surveys can be complicated, but there's one survey in Canada that says 52% of Canadian Jews don't identify as Zionist. Imagine that. That is not what the public, the media, the institutions, and the pro-Israel lobby groups are telling us. And I get numbers can be complicated, but that's one indication that there's a narrative that is not true out there about Jewish people and our beliefs. It seems to me that CIJA wants to build an image of themselves as the arbiters of Jewish identity, history, and experiences of anti-Semitism. And they do so in a way that repeats Israeli state propaganda. There's always a tension, I think, with Jewish identity-based activism in solidarity with Palestine. We know that we are often called upon to speak on issues relating to Palestine because of anti-Palestinian racism, because we're more palatable to institutions. And that reveals the racism of those institutions. So we have to find the balance of doing everything we can in solidarity with Palestine and Palestinian people, but we have to do so in ways that don't eclipse or further erase Palestinian voices. But when it comes to groups like CIJA, I see a really important role that can be played by anti-Zionist Jewish groups. Our report was written this year, and this is the first report of its kind in Canada about a pro-Israel lobby group. And why? Why is that? I think it's because CIJA is powerful, it's well-resourced, they're bullies, they include prominent people, they have a lot of resources, and they are famous for launching vicious attacks. But those attacks are most often directed at Palestinian people, Black people, Muslim people, racialized people. And they ignore us anti-Zionist Jewish people. So this is a space where we can exercise our privilege and speak up and challenge groups like CIJA. And when we do so, we need to do so with analytic clarity. So one of the contributions, the very tiny contributions that I made to this book makes the following points. I think too often groups like CIJA are focused on as the problem, the cause of Canadian government policy, for example. And even more problematically, sometimes are referred to as controlling government, that they drive the government of Canada and everything that government does is in response to CIJA. And I think that's an exaggerated idea of their influence. And I think it's really problematic. What I think we need to do is turn our attention to all of the institutions that listen to what CIJA says. Why? For years has CIJA been successful? I'm going to suggest at least two reasons. One, it's because what CIJA is saying is intelligible to governments and institutions, which are inherently racist. And they're inherently racist in particular when it comes to Palestinians. Politicians, governments, universities, decision makers, York Region, the public service, whoever, these are parts of these are colonial structures. And they've been primed to hear what CIJA is saying as legible. They've been primed through the war on terror against Muslims. Before that, they were primed through 100, 200 years of Orientalist colonialism. And we need to not lose sight of that and challenge those institutions. It shouldn't be surprising to us that CIJA advocates for Israel. They have it in their name. It should shock us because it's immoral, but it shouldn't surprise us. What should surprise us is these responses. They reveal something about who we work for, what these institutions are. Many of these institutions are anti-Semitic as well, but not in the way that's commonly understood. I've sat in meetings with decision makers, one in particular who came to me for advice about what to do about CIJA. They were pressuring the institution. So I said, meet with Palestinians, call it for what it is. If you see a genocide, say it's genocide. Follow your own policies of anti-racism. Be principled, take a stand. You're going to get lawsuits either way. So you have to just take a stand and decide where you want to stand on the side of history. His response, but they control everything. The media, the government, our funders, our donors. There were no donors at that institution that were... and so there is this sense that I've seen many times and I guess experienced where people are saying, literally kind of saying to me, but the Jews are everywhere and they control everything and they're gonna, and so this is also problematic. Another decision maker recently said to me that they had to take CIJA's opinion into account. CIJA's opinion was that anti-Palestinian racism doesn't exist and we ought not to talk about it. They had to take that into account because unlike other forms of discrimination, anti-Semitism is more controversial. And I said, the only reason that it's controversial is because people like you allow it to be controversialized. You are not adhering to basic anti-racism principles. You're getting scared of the Jews and the power, and you're capitulating and showing for who you are, which is racist. If we focus too narrowly on groups like CIJA, we miss the point. Zionism always was and is a settler colonial project that has had the backing of the British and now the American empires. Zionism was not originally a Jewish idea, but a British Christian imperial one. Lord Shaftesbury conceived of it as a way to rid Europe of Jews by sending them to Palestine, and also as a way of expanding the British Empire. So that doesn't mean that we ignore the harm that CIJA causes. We can't ignore it. Groups like CIJA are attacking us constantly, but it does mean that we can't for a minute lose sight of where our efforts need to be focused.
Thanks so much. I just wanted to start by saying that I'm here, I'm humbled, I'm inspired, I'm also scared. And I think that's important to say out loud because with me being here, I don't actually know what the consequences are going to be. And I'll share a little bit of my experience, but I'm humbled for the invitation to be able to speak to all of you and to be on this panel, and inspired by the struggles that our co-panelists have had to endure, and also to reflect and learn from that, and to find courage and more inspiration from that to be able to be part of these types of discussions. I'm scared because this is the first time that I'm speaking publicly about my experience. I've obviously spoken in thank you. I've spoken with close friends, spoken with colleagues, have received a lot of support from folks in the room, including IJV members from across the country. And my experience may seem, somewhat less significant or smaller and in comparison to, tangible losses that our colleagues have experienced. But I think, it's another, as you said, documentation in some way of what people have experienced. I was appointed exactly a year ago as the postgraduate medical education director for equity, diversity, and inclusion at McMaster University, where I've been an associate professor since 2018. That appointment came through a rigorous process, including a very thorough panel interview, and was, my appointment was internally announced mid-November, and I officially started in December of 2024. And the irony is, sort of within a few days or weeks, about 2 days before the holidays, I sort of received an email after clinic where the question that I was being asked in that email is that, are you feeling safe? And I was taken a little bit by surprise in terms of like, why am I being asked this question? And sort of I was subsequently informed that there was a whole email campaign that was being directed to leadership at McMaster, condemning my appointment and asking that I be removed. And so I sort of backtracked and went into social media space and tried to figure out what was going on. But a few days prior, Hillel Ontario and Hillel McMaster had launched an Instagram sort of campaign, essentially highlighting a number of tweets that I had retweeted, and also where I had been advocating for humanitarian aid in Gaza as a pediatrician, thinking about the children and the loss that folks were incurring as a consequence of the genocide. I also learned that in parallel, a group of doctors outside within Toronto called the DARA group, Doctors Against Racism and Anti-Semitism, in some of their newsletters had put out a call to email leadership to say that, this individual, referring to me, had been appointed, and that I, as a Jew hater, should not be in that position. And these are the explicit words that were mentioned. It's actually, to go back and read some of this stuff is also traumatizing in its own ways, and we can certainly reflect on that later on. And that call had been picked up by a MAGA Zionist in the US who had put out a tweet about this specific ask, and that subsequently had escalated the email campaign to leadership. So this all, I knew as I went into this role that there likely were going to be some bumps, but I sort of learned a lot about this sort of after the fact. This was right before the holidays, so we were 2 days going into the holidays, and so within that span I was connected to campus security, and I had to sort of explain kind of what was happening, and it was the first time in 7 years that, when I was at the McMaster parking lot, I was sort of turning to my back and saying like, am I safe? Like I was asking myself that question because I hadn't actually thought about that in the context in which I was living and sort of the comfort of my work and all of those other pieces. My advocacy had extended back over the course, since the genocide was accelerated in October 2023. So what sort of changed was that there's a group at MAC called the Faculty for Palestine, and as they became aware of this, they wrote a very strong letter of support to the institution, and that was then subsequently followed by a much wider campaign from a number of allies across the country, including, as I mentioned at the beginning, folks from IJV. And what was really heartwarming through that particular process was that what I learned is that many of the folks that were anti-Zionist Jewish colleagues were systematically going through my tweets to make sure that nothing that I said was anti-Semitic. And that was the label that had been put on me, is that I would make Jewish learners unsafe, that, by association, as was shared, that I would be unsafe for Jewish learners and Israeli learners, and that they had been receiving multiple complaints about me and from sort of these folks, and again they deemed all of this to be baseless and said, and you know, some folks were kind enough to BCC me on the emails where it said if there was any ounce of anti-Semitism that we would have found about Mohammed Zubairi's tweets, we would not have written this letter. And so that support was unwavering in many ways, and helped to neutralize the other side that was asking for my condemnation, for my dismissal from this particular appointment. I've been able to hold on to that appointment, and thank you. There are many aspects of this that involved a number of internal conversations that I can't speak about publicly just by virtue of not having consent of those specific folks, and that also reflects on the challenges that we're talking about over here. But I rode a roller coaster of emotions, experiencing both support and non-support from my own institution. And you know, as I reflected back, the conditions under which I was hired, and for the credibility that I brought at the time to the institution, and what was appreciated by the institution, as soon as I started to write or tweet about Palestine, I became you know, sort of part and parcel of that Palestine exception experience, and that, you know, did force me, and as I said at the beginning, it did force me to take a step back and pause and sort of say, okay, maybe I don't go on X or Twitter as much, or maybe I start to think about other ways in which to channel my advocacy that was important and core to me, and even asking myself the question that, you know, is this the right role for me at the time? So I had to navigate all of that, navigate and think a little bit more objectively about the safety of my own family. It led over the holidays to the police in Halton sitting inside my house, where I was again creating an incident report based on the advice of the National Council of Canadian Muslims, legal counsel, my own lawyer, at the time that I had engaged with, in terms of trying to figure out how do you navigate this situation, and heavily relied upon other people that had experienced similar things. And so there was a lot of learning and unlearning that happened through the process. I'll stop in a couple minutes where several months down the road, word for word, minus the specific tweets that they had highlighted, a campaign was created about a professor at TMU. And literally it highlighted that, you know, this was exactly a copy-paste approach that was being taken to sort of go to the next target. And so I sort of rode my wave, and it, you know, created a lot of discomfort, distress, psychological impacts that it had on me and my family. But, you know, that process then got replicated for another person, and is being replicated across the board for many, many people, some of whom were able to speak about this and others that are not. And I think it teaches us that what we need to think about, and certainly the space in which I existed, there was still some level of objectivity to be able to look at the facts, but that's not every institution. And so people have had to suffer quite significant losses because feelings overcome facts, and that has been one of the key learnings here, is that I could have been in a different context where the outcome may not have been the same, and that I've been able to keep my role, but I am constantly second guessing and thinking about everything that I'm doing at this point, because I worry about, as I said, what the consequences may potentially be as I look ahead. And so in conclusion, the last piece that I'll say is that still being able to be in the position does allow me and afford me a certain privilege to be able to do work in this space, but in a slightly different way. And so for about 6 months, I had sort of stepped back from social media, but again, I found the courage to sort of go back into that space and look at other ways through academic trajectories, letters to the editor, op-eds and so on, to be able to, again, continue to advocate for justice in what's going on with the genocide, and to really center the Palestinian voice within that particular space. So I'll stop there, and hopefully we'll have opportunities for questions.
Hello, friends. I'd like to take us all back to a political moment around April to May 2024, where after about a year and a half of all of us watching a live stream genocide, all of that energy that had been pent up for so long first started to be released. First among the students in the States, where we saw, students taking over the fields and then being arrested and then coming out and taking them back over. And then, and a lot of us started to repeat these in Canada and other countries. And just over at McMaster, where I was a grad student at the time, we set up an encampment like had been done in American schools and was starting to be done in Canadian schools. And it was peaceful, and honestly, it was for anyone. I think I recognized some faces that were there, and it was honestly really an idyllic little place. People connected and shared their experience, and I think a lot of people grew out of it, and we ultimately were all there for the same reason, and there was nothing about it that I think, even if you took it in the most bad faith way possible, could be seen as violent or hateful or anything. But nonetheless, after 3 weeks of occupying the field, on what we didn't know yet was the last day, myself and a number of other people, I think about 50, right after Friday prayer, went in a group to the office of the vice provost. And we had signs, and we were being a bit noisy, yes, but it was all peaceful. And we put up a letter, voicing our concern of the university's investments in weapons companies and academic ties to Israeli institutions and the like. And after about 15 minutes, we went back, and that was that. We didn't think anything of it. We later voted on a deal with the university that included a scholarship for Palestinian students, which has had some mixed applications, as well as disclosure of investments in all companies, which it was at least something. But where the actual repression didn't start while we're protesting, not for some time after. It's probably about a month after, where myself and 3 other students received emails letting us know that we were persona non grata from McMaster. And so what that meant was, if we were seen on school property for anything other than class or meeting with the supervisor or something like that, then we were subject to arrest under the Trespassing Act, and we would be probably immediately expelled and things like that. I also had 2 jobs at the university at the time. I was placed on leave from, and there was one student who, unfortunately the pressure really got to him, and it was part of him deciding to drop out. And so this was, a really tough time for us, and there's been really no recourse for it over the past, over a year that I've been banned from McMaster. And I was also happened to be president of QP 3906, the local union there at the time. In fact, all 4 people who were persona non grata were very involved in the union. And so this was sort of a way to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. But more importantly, to stop those 2 things from getting together, to stop the, radical politics of anti-imperialism from connecting with the labor movement and then carrying that out into the rest of the working class. And Catherine was targeted for, of course, the exact same reason. There's also been some current employment issues that it's caused, where they're refusing to pay me for some stuff. But I've just met a human rights lawyer actually who might be able to help me with that one. But the upshot of all this is not to say poor me, I got kicked out of school or anything like that. Because if I want to do a PhD, I'll find another school to go to. But there are no schools left in Gaza; they've all been destroyed. And so I think that the work that this book starts to do is firstly to contrast the absolute moral depravity of the people that are doing censorship and stifling voices with the moral clarity of people who are standing up and people who are hearing them. But beyond that, I think that by putting all these stories together, what the book is doing is identifying common strategies of repression that are used. Because we'll see it, similar ones in all of our cases, and those in the book and others, where you'll have media smears and employment consequences and rumors or anonymous vexatious lawsuits or human rights complaints. These things are all sort of used in an escalating pattern in almost every single case. And so that allows us to, build our playbook in response to that, and how we're going to respond to it if we can predict what's going to happen next. But I think most importantly, it sort of maps out, in my opinion, this is actually where I think the repression actually works to our advantage, is it shows us the exact points where they're weakest, right? Because the scale of the repression is exactly equivalent to how scared they are of what you're doing that's causing them to repress you. So when, our doctors start to take this, the philosophy of their profession to its logical, consequence and start speaking out about it, when our university professors start spreading these ideas in those institutions, when our lawyers start to take those views to positions of power, or even in our communities or in the labor movement, I'd say most importantly, they start to get really scared. But I'll tell you, their actual power is paper thin. And they show that just by how much they lash out. Because what they're really scared of is all of these people getting together and suddenly realizing that we're not so isolated. You don't actually have any power over us, and everybody out here supports us. So that's that, and we're gonna win one day.
First question.
Within the labor movement and also within political circles, and it's not just one party, it's the Green, it's the NDP, the Liberals, and especially the Conservatives. But it's always been my contention that human rights is something that concerns all of us. There's no gray area. You're either for human rights or you're against human rights. And so I see within the leadership of groups that shouldn't have that opinion, like within Labour, within the NDP, that are very anti-Zionism. And what, in your opinion, can we do to reverse that opinion within Labour, within political circles?
Just like any old school labor organizing, it's a one-to-one relationship. You have to talk to your colleagues, talk to your fellow union members, and bring each one along. And I think it's really about building those relationships and building that community, and that discussion is about, dispelling a lot of the myths that are being circulated and the Hasbara propaganda that if you support Palestinians, that you support terrorism, or that you're a Hamas lover, or any of those things. Anyways, that's the kind of discussions that we've been having in my union, anyways, at the member level, and trying to form, alliances in that way.
Go ahead first.
So it's actually a great question, because I think unions are very ununiform, if that's the way. Like, there's pieces of unions that are really good on this, and like CUP W has been in solidarity with Palestinians for 2 decades. QP Ontario passed a BDS motion in 2006. So yes, you have to organize with your coworkers, but I sometimes feel like we don't push our unions enough on this issue, right? Like, you just have to push these unions Otherwise, they are not going to take good positions on this because union leaders are afraid of being attacked because they're seeing what's happening to Fred Hahn, to myself, to Mason, right? And I think there's also a lot of suppression of this issue in locals. So when I look at kind of the landscape of the union movement, there's been a lot of success in getting resolutions of support and opening up space to talk about this issue at like the Ontario Federation of Labor, which just passed a hot cargo resolution. I think that actually is really freaking important. But then on the other hand, I consistently hear, I tried to bring this up at my local, my executive shut me down, right? They said this is not something that can be discussed at the local level, right? So we just have to, and this is why you see organizations like Labor for Palestine. That organization was created precisely because the unions have dropped the ball on this issue. And so folks just left that space and created networks of support and places to have these discussions and put forward education outside of the formal union structures.
Yeah, I'm similar to what Catherine said. Like, union leaders are going to take the path of least resistance most of the time, and you have to show that there's a large group of people whose vote on certain things is going to depend on your stance on this issue. And so you have to pose the question and then be organized enough that it's to your advantage when it's called. But the other thing is, and I've seen this at a couple conventions, is when we're making our arguments, you can either do it from a place of shared values or interests, in my view. And so when you're making an argument based on values, then you'll say things like, as unionists, we believe in human rights and dignity, and those things are clearly being violated. And so that's something that can sway a lot of people. But there's a lot of people who are going to think, this doesn't have a whole lot to do with me. This is happening on the other side of the world. Like, I work at, Humber River Hospital. I don't care. This doesn't have to do with my wages or benefits. And so you have to articulate it as a labor argument, which is a little bit tricky, but you can do it by either appealing to, say, we all have a shared interest in like the ability for free speech and for freedom of association and these other things that unions require and that are being violated by this. You can show them ways that they are. There's also you can show them how pension funds and things like that unions are tied to are already connected to some pretty nasty companies that are mixed up in this. And so you can argue from a position of neutrality and say, we're already involved, and so we don't want to be anymore. And that's a lot more compelling than, we should go do something new. And then finally, I would say teaching people about the history of it, and especially about, calls from the Palestinian labor movement, especially what comes to mind, the Palestinian Union of Postal Workers has a lot of material. And then there's also, look at the history of the longest general strike in history was in Palestine in 1936. And just show, there's something to this that we need to pay attention to.
Yeah, and I'll pass this on to you very quickly. 30 seconds or less. And just to piggyback off the point that Mason made. Yep, and you can take that to the bank. Not just that, but this may start, on Palestine. It won't end there, right? So you take a look at the United States, right, where over 35 states have BDS laws on the books. You know what they're doing now? They're extending that to the oil and gas sector, such that if you now start calling for the boycott of the oil and gas sector or the LNG sector, you're not fit to be a teacher. You don't think that Danielle Smith is probably taking a look at that? Out in Alberta, with how deified oil and gas is out there. So it may start there, but the interest of your members, if you don't care about that, if you don't care about the Palestine issue, those tactics are going to creep back way closer to home than you think. I just had thoughts after I finished, and yes, absolutely.
this is coming here, right? Like, whatever is being done to Palestine, I know we frequently talk about it as a testing ground for weapons. It's not just a testing ground for weapons, it's a testing ground for accumulation of capital and what these folks can get away with. And they're getting away with genocide while everybody, the entire world is watching it live, right? And so I think, you know, I would tend to agree with Mason that probably unions have the most power in this situation. You look at the Italian workers who just staged their third day of a general strike, front and center the issue of Palestine, but they're now raising the broader issue of a war economy. So yes, it's absolutely about the genocide in Palestine, and we need to cut ties with Israel and any trade with Israel, but this is a broader issue of the war economy and the fact that as workers, our standards of living are being eroded, social services are being cut because money is being funneled into weapons and war, right? So I think this opens up the entire question of capitalist economies for people in ways that has never happened up until this point in time. And why I actually keep talking about using this as an opportunity to say this is about capitalism.
If I can just add, I just want to add to this that in the political circle, this is also being used as a litmus paper by politicians to see how far, and all we have to do is look south of the border. We're seeing increased militarism towards Venezuela. We're seeing countries like the U.S. Supporting Israel against Palestine and providing blocks for anybody who wants to support Gaza and then the West Bank. And so I think this is another thing we have to be really careful about. They're gauging what people's response are to the genocide, and they're using it as forming their own political ideologies.
Thanks, Henry. We have another question. We have another question.
Hi, my name is Harry Shannon. I'm a retiree from McMaster and I'm Jewish. Mohammed mentioned the letter from Hillel that was sent and the campaign against him that they promoted. And I saw that letter, and I also saw the one that Mohammed mentioned at TMU. And what struck me there was they weren't just attacking Mohammed and the other professor as individuals. What they were doing was saying to the institutions, if you appoint anyone like this, we are going to make your life miserable. And so my question is, what can we do to try and preempt this, and how can we make sure that it doesn't happen?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have a good answer, but I think for me, one of the things that I've appreciated and I've been reflecting a lot about it is that what are our spaces and opportunities for that conversation and education, and Mason was getting at that as well, and how can we ensure that that kind of line of communication and education continues, and not superficially, but at a level of some kind of depth that happens across all the different layers, at least within the academy, is the perspective that I bring. But that's not an easy task because, again, it requires resource, energy, often time, and folks that have, the varied requirements within an academy in terms of their different responsibilities, whether those be clinical or teaching and so on. So trying to being able to balance that and who's best positioned to do that. And I think part of it, again, goes back to, how have we organized both internally within the institution, but also outside the institution to be able to have those channels of communication. But it'll take work from my perspective, and I'm sure other folks have thoughts in terms of how can we preemptively get behind that.
So I think one of the things that is used to advance this sort of thing. And I know that is the IHRA, that's the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition and examples on anti-Semitism. So the number of institutions, despite the fact that COUT, has taken a vote and basically soundly rejected it, university administrations still use it in their investigations. And this is sort of the way that this permeates is oftentimes these groups will say to university administrators, look, you've adopted this and now you have to live by it. You have to implement it. All of you have probably seen the statistics, for example, that over 60% of the country believes that what's happening in Gaza is a genocide and wants a two-way arms embargo. So why are, politicians, university administrators, decision makers, why is that not reflected, right? If liberal government's policies don't seem to reflect that. One of the reasons is that definition, right? People face a cost, right? So one of the things that we need to do is to target the adoption of the IHRA definition, right? Which makes it easier then for people to speak and then for governments and decision makers to feel the full brunt of that 60%, right? Right now, you could fill out a poll and say, yeah, I agree it's a genocide. I'd love a two-way arms embargo. Don't expect me to say that publicly, right? Because there's too much on the line. So we have to figure out a way to remove these impediments to people speaking out, right? Which is why the survey, Lil, that you did at the start, was so essential, right? That's one thing. I mean, in an ideal world, the whole reason universities exist, if you go back to the time of the founding of Oxford in the 11th century, and then Cambridge, which was, bar riot from a bunch of scholars, would send people to establish Cambridge. Don't know if that still happens anymore. A bunch of nerds beating each other up, forcing them to go north or south or west. But the whole idea is to remain independent from the state, right? So that the state can't dictate to you, you have to teach this or you have to, have these programs, not have these programs. Well, we're not in a different spot if donors are able to say, I gave you $1 million, and if you don't do what I tell you, Bill Ackman style, I'm going to withdraw those funds. So universities need to reconsider their relationship with donors to say, look, if you're making a gift, no takesy-backsies, right? Like you can't say, if you're not exploring how olive oil can cure cancer, I'm not interested in giving you money. Like, what are you talking about, right? Let us do the scholarship. You want to donate money, we'll name a building after you, like you got what you wanted out of it. Stay the hell in your lane now, right? That's it. You have to reimagine. Otherwise, we're back to this idea that universities aren't independent, right? Which there's no point of having a university. Oh, sorry. Yeah, of course.
One thing, thanks for that, both of you, everyone. No, that's great. I'm angry too. I just wanted to say, does everyone know what COUT is? The Canadian Association of University Teachers? The Canadian Association of University Teachers is what Birju was just talking about. And there was a motion a couple of years ago that rejected the IHRA definition, which is really big, and there was a lot of work that went into that. But recently, there was another motion passed by, I guess, pro-Israel folks saying we want COUT to commit to supporting faculties if they decline to pass divisive motions. It was like this nonsensical thing that said no divisiveness allowed, kind of, and it was rejected. And so every time this happens, we have to come together and work and have teach-ins and letters, and we can't stop doing that. But one of the things that is really important, actually, and I don't have a lot of faith in the legal system, but on this issue so far, universities ought, and many other employers, ought to be paying attention, because none of these arguments have been successful in court. And in fact, one judge echoed that this is, there's every reason to fear that we're in a McCarthy era. That's huge. None of these courts have gone as far as I would like them to. None of them have really named anti-Palestinian racism, but they have made really strong statements that allegations of anti-Semitism are baseless, right? And so universities and other institutions, if they don't care about human rights, and you can't get on, them to care about a genocide in Palestine, and you can't get them to care about the issues, what you might get them to care about is their legal liability, because right now all of these cases are making their way through the courts, and we can't. It's one time in my life as a lawyer that I'll say I think we can rely on some of those decisions to provoke some weight behind what we're saying. And I mean, my answer generally is we just have to continue what we're doing, which is grassroots organizing and not getting tired and pacing ourselves and making sure that we're in this for the long haul. Because the IRA, my institution rejected the IRA 3 years ago, and then 6 months later they issue something that is the IRA in other language. You have to keep fighting. If rights were actually real, we wouldn't have to fight so hard for them, but we do.
Yeah, so Harry, I understood you're asking what can we do to stop these kinds of attacks or to make them less likely. So I like what Jill just said of like just keep up our grassroots organizing, and just when we're confronted with these attacks to fight back with everything we've got. And I'm just going to say that Dr. Mohammed Zuberi's wife called me and asked me if I would write a letter to McMaster to support him. And I said, I'll write a letter to McMaster to support him, but I'm going to organize a campaign to get thousands and thousands of letters. And I called Dr. Gabor Mate, I contacted Naomi Klein. We ended up getting support from all over the place. And I was so committed to doing that because I wanted to defeat Hillel International. Hillel International had to experience that this didn't work. They did everything they could do, and it failed. And since then, the same thing has come up where people have called me. There was a medical student in Montreal. He was a valedictorian of his undergraduate class. He was accepted to Sherbrooke University Medical School. And when he was accepted, because he was also the president of the Muslim Student Association, and he organized support for Gaza, when he was accepted, Zionists attacked him viciously to get his admission to Sherbrooke Medical School revoked. And it was the same thing. His lawyer asked me, would I write a letter in support? And I responded the same way. I'll write a letter of support, but we need to organize. And we got hundreds and hundreds and thousands of letters from doctors. Actually, people on the admissions committee of McMaster Medical School wrote to Sherbrooke, and we defeated it. And that's happened again and again. So that's my answer to your question is just fight back. And I was sued for defamation by B'nai B'rith because I wrote a letter to the editor that of the Spec. The Spec published it, and I said in the letter to the editor, I'm going to repeat this right here, right now, B'nai B'rith is a racist, anti-Palestinian hate organization that was published in a newspaper. So they sued me for defamation. And I'm like, yeah, bring it on. I'm going to lawyer up right now. We'll go to court. I will explain to the judge why that's true, and that will be the headline in the next newspaper, So that's my answer, is just don't back down. Gather supporters, allies, reach as far as you can, bring in people. And I'm kind of saying this to anybody here who might experience some kind of attack or feeling intimidated or like you can't stand up for yourself. Just rouse support. You can call me, and I'll do whatever I can to help you. Right, I'll call Bear Jew. That's right.
Thanks, David. Thanks. We have another question.
And so I'm looking for who are our political allies. I'm aware of Heather McPherson. I'm aware of Sarah Jama. Mike Maurice, who's no longer an MP because he spoke out in favor of Palestinian human rights, and that led to an organized kind of get rid of this MP. But I'm just wondering, in your experiences, the people on the panel here, which politicians have contacted you and which ones have given you their personal support, if any? I would like to know who our allies are. That's my question.
Thank you. Thank you.
So back when, with what I experienced, which in a lot of ways, yeah, it was very much political. So first thing I'll say, just to tie a bit of a bow and to piggyback very briefly on Rabbi David's point, and I totally buried the lead on this, but I have launched defamation suits against CJA, B'nai B'rith, Dahlia Kurtz, Ezra Levant, Rebel Media, and who am I missing? Melissa Lensman, of course. So, and so it's better to be on offense than on defense, and so that's just to say, if you spot an opportunity to go on offense, make them answer your questions rather than you defending yourself. Just to tie the bow on that, but and this won't be an entirely satisfying answer, but when these politicians were, just saying like violent, venal things about me, there was not a peep out of the NDP. Other than Randall Garrison, I think, said, and by the way, Randall Garrison is probably was the most pro-Israel out of anyone in the NDP. And he said, well, he's got a strong human rights record. Let's see what the investigation says. This is an investigation into, prove you're not an anti-Semite investigation, which concluded that we cannot find anything he's done, said, that's anti-Semitic. He does not harbor any beliefs that are anti-Semitic. He has no conscious or unconscious bias against Jews or Israelis. Nevertheless, which is the thing that Randall Garrison said that the NDP was waiting for, not a peep from anyone, including Heather McPherson. I'm from Alberta. I like Heather McPherson, but I had a friend, someone I grew up with, who's Palestinian, who was meeting with Heather McPherson and someone else with a bunch of activists. And he told her about me. This is at the height of it, right? So like the story hadn't ended. And she said, I haven't heard of that. Let me write it down. And he told her, he said, if this happened to him, my daughter, and she was 14 at the time, his daughter, he said, how is she ever supposed to hold a public office? If this happened to him, he's not Palestinian, how can my daughter hold this position? And apparently that really moved her. But again, to this day, not a peep. The reality is that unfortunately, we live in a capitalist system. I was happy to see that she stood up for Mohammed Faqih, but Mohammed Faqih has position, power, and privilege, right? He was a very well-connected guy. So she took a selfie outside Paramount to say, back him, which, by the way, is the right move. Yes, do back him. But they don't seem to be the friend of, the average person who doesn't come from, I'm the son of a refugee. My father came to this country with $20 dropped in Montreal, hadn't even seen snow before, right? No inherited wealth, none of that. So unfortunately, I don't, again, I really haven't seen anyone. I like Matt Green. He got voted out. Nikki Ashton, I had people from Whitehorse writing Nikki Ashton, not a peep, right? So unfortunately, these rooms are chambers of mediocrity. They're not going to, and I'm thinking of the prayer that Rabbi David opened with, right? We need to roll up our elbows, politics or no politics, right? We're just going to have to make them hear us or suffer a political consequence as a result. But the politicians themselves, I've always been heartbroken every time I have hope, and so I'm just not putting my eggs in that basket anymore.
Yeah, I was just going to echo that. I've spoken to Ontario NDP members about this issue, right? And it's not making it very clear, it's not just me. There's a lot of workers that are being terminated and facing serious repercussions. You've literally said nothing, right? And they won't say anything. So yeah, that is the political landscape. I've had one councillor from Niagara, Haley Bateman, who has publicly come out and stood with me. That is literally it, right? And Nikki Ashton also was unelected in the last election too. So, because she was vocal on this issue when, I think it cost her a lot internally within the NDP, but.
I was just going to add a little bit. I said I work for the Ontario Public Service, and as civil servants, we serve all governments, regardless of the political stripe. The last few years have been really difficult, and I've heard from my Muslim colleagues that they find it really difficult to come into work after they see their minister at the ministry they work for tweeting Islamophobic, hateful stuff about Muslims. And just to confirm, there are no friends in any of the politicians, but the politicians do make our lives difficult in that sense, that they set the tone about, we've all heard Doug Ford calling Palestinian flags like hate flags and Hamas flags, and that, so that adds an extra layer of fear for us in our work.
Regarding politicians, I just want to mention that Hamilton Center, Aslam Rana, signed on to the Jenny Kwan's, help me out here, No More Loopholes bill. And he did this because a whole bunch of us wrote him letters. And we talked to people in his office because we're not sure he really knows anything, really, but he is listening to his constituents. What?
One person in the political game who I think is solidly with us is Eve Engler. And he's been excluded by the NDP from being a candidate, but he hasn't gone away, and the game's not over. I'm just saying that if you're interested, look into it more, or come and talk with me later about Eve Engler.
I feel like in this work we're constantly on the offensive. Everyone's always like, so and so is under fire for such and such thing, watermelon pins, etc., Twitter posts, whatever they may be. And we're always on the offensive, and there are these are very large groups, like Hillel CIJA, they're very powerful groups. At what point in time are we all gonna gather our power together and start putting together some massive lawsuits? Because we have lots and lots of gathered evidence, and it is a big job and it's a big task, but at what point in time are we going to start setting precedences that this type of behavior is no longer acceptable? And I know I heard somebody speak about when you can go on the offensive, do it. I think that requires also a certain amount of capital as an individual to be able to do that, and not all of us have that capital. So I feel collectively, at what point in time are we going to, really, and maybe this work is already being done and I'm unaware of it, but I would love to hear more.
Yeah, I'll take a quick crack at this. I mean, as someone who has filed a bunch of lawsuits, I will say, and I think particularly on that capital part, you are right to point that out, right? I've spent, I've already spent well into the six figures, and we aren't yet, or although we're approaching the discovery phase, where you turn over documents and things like that. So the most expensive stage of the litigation is about to come up, and I've already spent six figures. I have a crowdfunding page where I set a target for 200,000. I've raised about just slightly over 30,000, right? Which is great, but it's 10% of, So I think one of the things to be aware of, and I'm really glad that you asked this question, because York University identified between 400 and 500 people that have experienced adverse job-related things whose stories we don't know about. And the reality is not just to get justice or uptown justice, you need money, Otherwise, I mean, anytime you lose your job and you're not unionized, you lose access to benefits, right? So the thing that likely traumatized you the most, you now can't get treatment for, right? Because it's expensive. If you have money to pay lawyers, right? Like your bills are huge. And I've talked to people about this. So whenever a lot of money leaves a bank account and your equity to debt ratio goes up, so your credit score goes down, so people who had plans to buy houses and things like that, they can't do it anymore, right? So I think one of the things, and you're right, we have the evidence, right? Like we have solid cases, we can set the precedent. We don't have the resource, so that too has to be grassroots, right? So I think, I'm more critical of my friends, the people that I grew up with on this, because I'm like, hey, I've gotten $100 or $200 at a time from perfect strangers, people I grew up with, not doing anything, right, for me. I'm like, come on, get yourself in gear. But, what I might do is, my crowdfunding page is out there. I know that Rabbi David has tweeted it before. I'll see if I can get it out there. But I think just getting those things out in a grassroots way, hey, this person is suing this person, help them out, right? So that they don't have to worry about the resources. Because at the moment, my story, you would not have heard at the height of it. The Maple didn't report it. The Breach didn't report it. Ricochet didn't report it. Omar Al-Akkad in his book talks about this because what if I really am a terrorist, right? They don't want to take the risk. But that means when you don't hear these people's stories, they go in with a power imbalance and they end up, when Rabbi Mavassar was talking about signing the NDAs, we have to shed light and uplift those people that are doing this, right? And one of those ways is, get out there, share their stuff, share their information. But when they're experiencing this, don't let legacy media be the ones to report it and then make it disappear, right? Don't let your comrades disappear, right? I think that's the strategy. Like everything else we've discussed, grassroots, right? Whatever you have, right? Skill sets, if you're good at comms, if I try and provide as much advice as I can to people, when they're filing human rights complaints and things like that. We all have something to contribute, but contribute in trade, contribute however you can, because really the only way we lose, and a lot of these, actors know this, is if they're well-resourced, they'll drag it out so you can't afford it anymore. They can't win in court, they have to win outside. So.
I feel like maybe Jillian should speak to this. I feel like, yeah.
I have really mixed feelings about, there's times when you have to use the legal system, you don't have a choice, but I have mixed feelings about using it as offensively, although I have mixed feelings, so I'll share some of those. One is that I've long thought that we need a defamation lawyer who's dedicated to this issue and this issue alone and builds a firm and does pro bono work and all of those things just to be able to respond and start suing people when they say certain things. But the other thing is, even though the courts have been somewhat okay on the issue of what's anti-Semitism and what isn't, I don't think that we can trust that the colonial legal system will take care of us in terms of when we bring and put all of our resources as an optional thing into a lawsuit. I have real concerns about that because I don't trust the outcome, right? Because we're talking about a colonial Western liberal structure of rights that is, as a structure, it's inherently racist and has never really recognized, well, to my knowledge, anti-Palestinian racism. But even when the Supreme Court talks about Islamophobia, it's different than when they talk about anti-Black racism or anti-Indigenous racism. And I'm not saying they're good on those things, but I'm saying it's very different, and it's been recognized less than other forms of discrimination and hatred. And so I have real concerns about putting all of our resources and fundraising into an ideal lawsuit that may actually go horribly wrong. So I don't know. But I do think that going on the offensive when we can is always, and it's hard. I've struggled with that in this movement for a long time. I have to tell you that the CJ report felt really satisfying because it is a way of going on the offensive. And the other thing is, when you meet with administrators and people, and some of them can see right away, especially if they're not white, they've met with CEJA. They had their own experiences with groups like that who are just racist and say racist shit, and so this report, something like this, can give those people the confidence that they need, like that it's said, it's documented, it's real, right, to move forward. But so I think we have to look for ways always to try to be proactive. Passing motions on being against settler colonization generally, not to do with Palestine, is a strategic move on Palestine. And we've used those at my institute. Like, there's a million things that we can do to be proactive to build infrastructures of anti-racism, which we also, right now in this moment, have to fight for because it's all being eroded.
It is a little bit after 9, so we are going to start to wrap up. Where is Jennifer? Are we going to get thrown out? Okay, well, it's good. We have one more question, and then I have an announcement from Ken and an announcement from Anne. Yeah. And then we have like huge rounds of applause and lots of jumping up and down and screaming. An announcement from David. Okay, one question, 3 announcements, and then wrap it up. Round of applause.
So I like some some advice, but just a couple points before. So as you were saying about capitalism, so I supply teaching immigrants, and Carney has cut the funding for that. So basically the only immigrants who will be taught English that are here are so low level you can't even have a conversation with them. So that's one thing. And then act against me was I've been going to the Jewish food bank in Dundas outside Hamilton. And there was a new woman there. And I said, oh, where are you from? Like, she was a worker there. She goes to Moldova. And then she said she moved to Israel. And I said, oh, why did you come here? Because of the massacre going on in Gaza? And she goes, oh, no, more people have died, more Israelis have died than Palestinians. And I think she meant historically. So then I got some stuff. And then I go back for the next month. And the guy goes, no, you can't come in. And he doesn't even know why. I got a letter saying I'm banned from all the Jewish services, from the food bank, from everything. So I did talk to the human rights, legal support, blah, blah, blah. So, I'm going to write something to the tribunal and stuff. But if you have any suggestions, yeah.
I think it's just really sorry to hear that happened, right? And I think one of the threads that comes out is when public institutions get privatized, right? Like, this is the reality of what happens. When institutions that should be funded impartially by the state end up receiving funding from private donors, whether that be a hospital, a university, a food bank, then ideology, ruling class ideology, seeps into who's getting services, who's not, who's getting better services, who's getting worse services, and who, gets to be employed there.
Go ahead. That's just horrendous, what they're doing.
I'm sorry, I know you guys said last question was gone, but
Okay.
I really want to ask this question.
Very last question.
Sorry. Since a lot of you guys got fired for basically saying something to Solidarity on either Twitter or any other social media, from McMaster, from being a fellow paramedics in Gaza, what is stopping us to do more radical actions, like taking example from Indigenous people in 2020 that blocked the railroad, that brought down the whole Canadian government economy? What's stopping us to do the same thing? If you're already going to lose our jobs for small things like that, why not take a bigger step to bring the whole economy down for us to be heard and for the whole genocide to be brought to the main media? That's my question.
Thank you for that. I was just, in response to the question about the courts, like, I don't think that is where we make the wins. I think what you're describing is how we make the wins. I think it's not a surprise that it was after, I believe, the second day of a general strike in Italy that this pretend ceasefire was somehow quickly negotiated. I think we're in a moment where working class people have so many grievances that this issue is just pushing the envelope to a spot where I think the ruling class can see that there are points that are going to break, right? And it's really difficult when you live in this country and there isn't a union movement to rely on that understands what class is, let alone what the international working class is. It is really difficult, but I also often think about what was happening before the pandemic started and the fact that it was Indigenous land defenders who really were fighting the state in a very successful way. They were shutting the economy down. And I also think that when I see what's happening in Gaza and in all of Palestine, I think it's folks that are basically have been colonized in one way or another that are pushing this entire fight, and they're at the forefront of this entire fight. And so inspiring to look at the workers in Italy. Yeah, and I'll just, sorry, I don't have a concrete answer for how we get there, but I think
Angeloon has something to say, but I'm wondering if Mason could speak to the experience of the encampment was huge, and that is like people getting together, if possible.
Yeah, I was just going to say there was an Indigenous delegation in the COP, the climate change conference in Brazil last week or the week before that also shut down the conference to bring their issues. And I think what Gaza has taught a lot of us and has opened a lot of people's eyes is that it's not just about Palestine, that it is about Indigenous rights and human rights everywhere, and that we need to support Indigenous struggles everywhere. And I think a lot of people have had their eyes open to that. And I don't have the answer. I know I'm not suggesting we all go shut down the railroads, but I think we need to look at the land back movement and learn about it and support it.
Yeah, so I think that like the elements you have to balance are first, what is going to give you leverage, right? So stopping the railway is going to give you a lot of leverage, but you have to balance it with how long you can sustain it. So like an encampment on the field, we can sustain for a lot longer than if we did one in a building or in a railroad, because they're going to clear us out pretty quickly. And then also the amount of support that you have. And then you take those three things together and you build on what you don't have yet. Say like you don't have enough support. We spend, some months organizing, fundraising, things like that. And then once you have those elements together, then you want to pursue your strategy in a way that is going to deliver the change that you want. So I think that like something that came out of the encampment movement, while it was, it was great in terms of like mobilizing public support, we didn't have a lot of leverage actually by being on the field, right? Like it created a public space and we had our own little community and it got a lot of conversations going and we had leverage that way, and it was a bad PR for the school, but we weren't really shutting down, aspects of daily life. Whereas at, say, Columbia, they were on the football field where graduation would normally be held. And so that gave them a lot more leverage because suddenly they had disrupted the university's operations. So I think that you can draw a lot of lessons from that specifically, but also from, the examples of, like you said, the land defenders beforehand and basically any social movement, and try to find within it, leverage, length, and the balance of forces in terms of how much support you have, and then from there you go and cause some trouble. So that's all I got.
One quick last thing is, if you don't know, in Hamilton there's a WhatsApp group with over 200 people that is called Hamilton Palestine Solidarity. And it just helps us all connect with each other. You know, so we can share information and strategies and these questions we're coming up with. So if you use WhatsApp and you'd like to be in that group, you can just see me and use this QR code and join it. And that's it.